Hello everybody, I'm Nora and I'm back with a fun winter project for us. So this is not something I've actually ever done before, and I've never seen it done. I've never seen like any internet tutorials on this or anything. I'm sure it's been done 100 times, and there could be a reason why I haven't seen this done. And hopefully that reason is not because when you do blankets this way, they don't come out very good, but we'll find out. So what I want to do is I want to take an existing blanket, a blanket that I bought at the store, and that I want to make it warmer. So I purchased enough fabric lengthwise to be the same size as this blanket. And what I want to do, I want to sew the existing blanket to the new piece of fleece, right sides together, sew around the edge, turn it right side out, and then top stitch so that it is a blanket. It's like a 2-layered blanket. I bought enough fleece for it to be lengthwise. However, when I got home, what I didn't think about is that I did not buy enough. Well, it's not that I didn't buy enough. It's that the way that it comes off of the spool is that it's not wide enough. I decided instead of going and buying another piece, I would see what I had and then I could just kind of fill in the pieces. So I'll show you the initial blanket. Here's the blanket. So it's pretty big. So it has kind of this, fuzzy look to it. So I like this blanket. It's relatively warm. It's not super warm. It will certainly be warmer with another layer. So there's this is the blanket. Here is the other fabric. And so I'm not sure, I'm questioning my judgment because there's no brown in this fabric. As you can see, it's like green and purple and pink and yellow. There's no brown, but I'm hoping it's like a similar enough tone that it will look good together. So then what I found in my fleece stash, I found a couple of pieces of this purple and a pink. So there's pink in the flowers and there's purple in the flowers. So I'm just gonna take these pieces and I am going to sew the pieces together and then make a full-size backing. The first thing I need to do is to take off the edge. So I need to cut this off and then it will be ready to go onto these pieces and we'll do all that together. So let's go cut. Before we get started, I wanted to give you 2 tips. These are things that I have made mistakes about in the past, and perhaps you will learn from my mistakes. So the first one is about the rotary cutter. Change your blade. Now, the experts will say that you change your blade after every quilt. And for those of you quilters out there, you know there's a lot of cutting in a quilt. Now, I've made like a gazillion. That's not true. I've not made a gazillion quilts. I've made like 3 quilts, but I've never changed my rotary cutter blade. And I should, and you should too, because a couple weeks ago, I now have to press so hard on my rotary cutter because the blade is dull that I was pressing so hard that it kind of scooped up and it cut my finger. And that was a good size cut. So that's another tip, is you should be wearing cutting gloves. I do not wear cutting gloves. I still, after that, do not wear cutting gloves, and I still have not changed my rotary blade, but you should. I'm gonna use this rotary blade until it's, as dull as can be. So don't do that. Change your blade. I don't think you need to change it as frequently as those experts say, but maybe every couple months you should change your blade. It's been years and I haven't changed it. So after this project, I am committing to changing my blade. Tip number 2, for your large cutting mats, one of the problems with the cutting mats is that they are hard to store. And so I kind of tucked mine behind a dresser, standing up and down against the wall. Well, the pressure of gravity kind of warped my cutting mat so that no matter what I do now, no matter how many books I lay on top of it, no matter how much time it sits with pressure on it, there's always a warp in it. And that will not affect your projects like the project we're doing today. But if you're doing specific quilting where every teeny tiny mega millimeter inch counts, that warp will affect your quilt. So do not store your cutting mats standing up and down. A great place to store your cutting mat is under your bed. An even better place, in my opinion, to store your cutting mat, which is what I do, is under a rug, because nobody sees it and it's so easy to grab. It doesn't get dusty. You could just lift up the rug, yank it out, and you have your cutting mat. So store your cutting mats flat. And that's it. That's all the information I have for you today. But let's get started. I'll tell you what we're gonna do first to cut here. So I'm gonna make sure, the other thing I will say is that I have washed all of my fleece fabrics. Actually, that's not true. I have washed the new fleece fabric. I have not washed the existing fleece fabric, but let's not even talk about the washing. So I have my blanket. I folded it in half. Make sure it's nice and even. And then I placed it on my cutting mat. So it's folded in half and I place it on my cutting mat, and it is still long enough, even being folded, that it will go a little bit off the edge. That's okay. We're gonna put our ruler down right along the edge, and we're gonna trim off the edge of the fabric. So I got to the length of my ruler, and now I'm just going to pull the fabric down so that the top of the fabric is on the cutting mat. So cut all the way up to the top. This will be your first side, and then you'll do the same exact thing with all other three sides. I just broke my blade. So evidently, when you have to press too hard on your blades because they're dull, this happens. All right, there it is. So now I am going to change my blade. Well, unfortunately, I cannot find the replacement blades for that particular rotary cutter. I think it's possible I don't have any. But I do have this other rotary cutter, which is about the same size. It has this like weird curve in the handle. And I'm still getting used to this one. I think this is more for like projects where you're having to curve. I haven't really gotten a handle of this one yet. No pun intended. But we're gonna give it a try for this blanket. And actually, because I haven't used this one so much, the blade is nice and sharp, which is great. But I am going to get out my cutting glove because I'm having to press so hard, not only because my blade was dull, but because I'm going through two pretty thick layers of fabric on the blanket. I'm having to press pretty hard, and I don't want to, again, injure myself. So I am gonna use my cutting glove. So here we go. And I have my cutting glove, here we go. This rotary cutter does not seem to be working well on this blanket, and it has nothing to do with the blade. It has something to do with the mechanics of this that I need to figure out, and I just don't want to take the time right now to do it on this blanket. So I'm going to use this teeny tiny rotary cutter. I'm going to try this one, which I'm a little agitated about because I really don't like using such a small rotary cutter on such a big blanket. I don't know how it's going to work. Let's give it a try. Okay, it worked. I got that one side done, but I'll tell you what, I am not going to use, I actually have a crick in my neck from using that because I had to press so hard. That is not the rotary cutter for this project. For the flannel, when I cut that, I think that'll be fine. I can make some nice crisp edges, sew the pieces together. That should be okay. But for the rest of this blanket, I'm not gonna cut the rest of this blanket with a rotary cutter. I am gonna cut it with my scissors, which I typically would say don't do, and this is the reason why I didn't start from the beginning cutting with my scissors, is because every time you cut and then you go to cut again, there's a little gap, there's a little space where it won't line up perfectly. It won't be one nice continuous motion. And so when you're trying to sew against another piece of fabric, that can not be the best. But, you know, this is just a project that's gonna, you know, live on my couch, so I'm not really too worried about it. So let's use the scissors. I'm still gonna double this up so that I have less surface area to cut, and I'll just start cutting right along. I cut everything, and I'm feeling a little bit silly because after I cut that first side with the rotary cutter, I thought I had 3 more sides to cut. And then I cut my second side and I thought I had 2 more sides to cut, but I finished cutting and I was like, oh, I'm done, because when you fold it over, you only have 2 sides to cut. Duh. I'm still not sure how that works. I feel like I have another side here somewhere. Do I? No, I don't. I don't have another side. I've cut everything, even though I've only cut 2 lines. It doesn't quite make sense to me, but I guess it works. So now I'm gonna cut my fleece. And I'm going to take my pink and my purple fleece pieces and cut those to be nice straight lines horizontally, so that then I can sew those fabrics together and then trim the edges nice and straight and attach that to the big floral piece. And that will be the back, or I guess it could be the front of the quilts. Nice and pretty and floral, so I guess that would be considered the front. But I'm gonna go get those pink and purple pieces and we'll cut those. And then I have 2 of these purple pieces. This one's gonna have to be pretty thin because I've already taken a chunk out of that for another project. I made a baby bonnet out of this that was super cute, but now I will only have a tiny strip of that at the top. And then, gosh, I hope I do have enough of this. Hold up. Let's measure. I'm actually about 1 inch short, but we're gonna make it work because this is what we're doing. I'm using these pieces. We're only 1 inch off. We'll make it work. But what I'm gonna do first is I'm going to cut this piece first. This pink is nice and squared off. This purple is not. I need to make this be a nice solid rectangle. I trimmed off the edge so that this is the width that I need this to be. I'm gonna use my 2 ruler trick. I'm gonna line my ruler up against these gray lines at the bottom of my mat, which I know you can't see, but you're probably familiar with a cutting mat and you know that it has a grid on it. And so I'm going to line my ruler up right like that. Then I take this ruler and I line it up so that I can see this straight line of my second ruler matches the straight line on the cutting mat over here, so that I know going up from the very bottom, I measure the very bottom, my line is measured up, then I go a little farther up my ruler, still measured correctly, all the way to the tip, and that's good. So I'm gonna cut. Then I just bring my ruler all the way up to the top, and now I don't need my second ruler because the bottom of my ruler will be lined up on the line that I just cut, and the top of my ruler can be aligned with the number. And this little rotary cutter is working great here. Then I'm going to turn it over and do the same thing. And now I have this strip. I'm going to sew this purple strip to this pink strip here. I sewed the purple piece to the pink piece, all the way from one side to the other. There's a little extra pink going over the edge, which is fine. I just had more pink width than I needed, but I'll just slice that off at the end. So I'm gonna do the same thing that I did with this purple piece, with the second purple piece, square off the edges, attach it to the bottom of the fabric, so I'll attach it to the other end of the fabric, and then I'll have one long piece that I can attach to the floral part. I sewed the other purple piece on, so now I have a purple piece at the top, and then one at the bottom. So I'm gonna measure this. This should be about 96 inches long, actually 95, because when I first measured these out, it was about a hair of an inch too short. So let's see if now that I've sewn these together, it's close to 95, hopefully even on the 96 edge. Unfortunately, I'm at about 92 and a half, so it's short. But I'm just gonna cut off some more of that dang blanket because this is the direction we're going. I don't know why it's so much shorter than when I initially measured, but that's okay. It'll just be a little bit smaller of a blanket, no problem. The next step is to attach the left side of this piece. So if I were to lay this piece out nice and flat, the piece that's on the left, I want to attach to the side of the floral piece. So I need to make sure that the left side of this blanket, the left side of this really long piece, is nice and crisp line, 90-degree angles. So let's cut that line now. And to cut that line, I'm going to, again, put my fabric in half. So you can see there's the top and bottom. So I folded this in half. My top and bottom are now squished together. I'm gonna do my trick to make sure that it's even, going all the way up. And then I'm gonna cut. I'm gonna scooch my fabric all the way down, smooth it out. So now I've cut this nice and straight, and I'm gonna sew this onto my floral piece. Here is the front of the blanket all laid out. And now I'm going to put right sides together, the back of the blanket with the front of the blanket. I'll pin all along the edge, and then I'll trim and sew. What I did is I laid the fleece out on the ground, and then I put the existing blanket on top of it, and I pinned all the way around the edges. About, I'd say, 6 pins per side. Now, I'm not a big fan of pinning typically, and this is the first time that I pinned in this project. When you're sewing a blanket that large, the pieces together, you really want to have it pinned because things can shift really easily. So I went ahead and pinned it, and I sewed all the way around, leaving a little gap. Here is the gap that I left. So it's about this, say maybe 4 inches, 4-inch gap, you know, an 1.5 inch seam allowance there. So that's a good size seam allowance. But when you're sewing with really thick materials like that, it's always a good idea. So I left myself a nice size seam allowance, left my gap, and then I took out all my pins. And then the next step, which we will do together, take your scissors and we're gonna cut, see if you can see, here's the corner. You're gonna cut right on the diagonal. And this is to take away the bulkiness. So if I were not to do that and flip it right side out, it would be super bulky in the corners. It wouldn't lie flat and it'd be really hard to sew over. Now that I've trimmed all of my corners, I'm going to reach my hand into that hole that I left, and I'm going to flip this whole blanket inside out. And that's where the magic happens. That's where you get to see how this is really gonna look when it's all done. I turned my blanket right side out, and I am relatively happy with it. I do have 1 or 2 thoughts about this that we can talk about at the end, but it's nice and cozy. I mean, it's feeling really, really great. It's nice and thick, soft, perfect. This worked out really well, I would say. The other thing is, as I mentioned, I was going to top stitch around the whole thing. Top stitching is just adding a little extra stitch right along the edge. It's a great way to close up the hole, because what you do is you just make sure that your sides of the fabric are kind of tucked into the blanket. So you can see that. If you kind of open the hole, you can see they're nice and tucked in there. You make it nice and flat, and then you do a seam just along the edge, and that closes the hole, but you keep going. So after you've gone over the hole, you go around the whole blanket, and that helps the blanket to lay flat. And in most cases, I would say, when you do a blanket where you turn it right side out, closing up the hole, top stitching is the way to go. But for this blanket, I actually don't think it needs it. It doesn't look to me like it needs that extra, top stitch to lay it flat. The edges seem to really naturally kind of push out really well, and I think it's looking great. So what I'm gonna do instead of closing up the hole by top stitching all the way around, I'm gonna close the hole by doing a invisible stitch, or they also call it a ladder stitch. So I'm gonna hand stitch this little piece closed, and then I'll be done with the blanket, and we can chat for a minute, and then I'm gonna go snuggle. The blanket is finished. I stitched up that little opening there, and I'm really glad I didn't top stitch it. It doesn't need it. It's really warm, has a nice heavy weight to it. There it is. And I'll see if I can show you the full blanket here. It's pretty large. So the only thing I would say is that I wish that the strip of the purple and pink was a little bit smaller. It's taking up almost half the blanket right now, which visually just isn't super appealing in my mind. So I wish it was a little bit smaller, just kind of a little strip down the side. But besides that, I think this is great. Successful project. You too can go out and buy a blanket and warm it up. So thanks for doing this project with me, adding a little heft to my blanket, and I'll see you next time. Bye.